Amara lived in a gleaming penthouse above Lagos, married to Kofi, a real estate magnate whose name commanded respect across 3 countries. Her life was constructed from silk, marble, and the kind of silence that only wealth can buy. But beneath the diamonds and driver's licenses, something was corroding, a hollowness that grew with every gala, every closed door, every time she caught her reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Then came the night of the flood. A stranger appeared at her gate, soaked, trembling, carrying nothing but a child's drawing and a question that shattered everything she thought she knew about her husband. What began as a moment of pity became an act of defiance that would cost her everything she had built. In choosing this poor stranger over Kofi's empire, Amara discovered a truth so profound it would rewrite the meaning of wealth, redemption, and what it truly means to be rich. This is a story about the price of conscience and the courage it takes to walk away from power when you finally understand what it was built upon. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we tell stories that prove compassion can rise from the most unexpected places. Chapter 1. The Penthouse and the Prisoner. The apartment on the 47th floor was designed to impress. All floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Lagos sprawl, the Atlantic bleeding gold at sunset, marble floors that clicked like judgment beneath every footstep. Amara moved through it like a ghost, through a museum of her own life, wearing clothes that cost more than families earned in months, touching nothing that belonged to her. The decor was Kofi's choice. Minimalist, aggressive. The aesthetic of a man who believed beauty was measured in square footage and exclusivity. Everything was white, black, and chrome, cold geometries that reflected light but absorbed nothing. Even the art was corporate. Abstract pieces chosen by designers, not collectors, hung at precise angles that suggested mathematics rather than feeling. She stood at the window this particular evening, her reflection ghostly against the city lights below. Kofi was in his study, the heavy mahogany door closed, voice low, speaking numbers into a phone. Always numbers, always that tone, calculated, stripped of warmth, the way a man talks when he's deciding something that affects people he'll never meet. The study was Kofi's sanctuary. She rarely entered. When she did, she noticed the portraits on the walls, his parents, his business partners, his achievements rendered in expensive frames. But no photographs of them together. She had never noticed this absence before. Now it was all she could see. She had loved him once. That much was true. 10 years ago, when he was younger, and she believed that ambition was the same thing as purpose. They had met at university, she studying social work, him already wheeling and dealing, already talking about changing Lagos's skyline. She had admired his vision then. Now she understood. The vision was just another word for appetite. He had courted her deliberately. She recognized this now with the clarity that only distance provides. He had positioned himself as the visionary, and she as his moral compass, the woman who would make him seem complete, humane, connected to something beyond profit. She had played the role perfectly. The marriage had no children. Kofi said it would complicate the timeline. The timeline for what? He never specified. There were affairs, though they were never discussed. She had found a hotel receipt once, lipstick on a collar, a photograph on his phone that vanished when she asked about it. She had said nothing. That was part of their arrangement, her silence in exchange for security. There was money everywhere, but nowhere to spend it that felt like living. There were friends who visited, but they were all like Kofi, hollow-eyed men in expensive suits, women who laughed at jokes that weren't funny, everyone performing a version of happiness that looked like contempt. The conversations were always the same: who had bought what property, which politician had been bribed, which union had been broken, which environmental impact report had been creatively rewritten. Amara had stopped asking questions years ago, stopped wondering why Kofi came home late smelling of whiskey and something like ash, stopped noticing the phone calls he took in the garden, the letters marked confidential, the way he looked at her sometimes with something between affection and apology. She spent her days with a therapist who was very well paid to help her understand that her emptiness was actually fulfillment. She volunteered at charity galas, where women like her, wives of powerful men, raised money for causes they had never personally witnessed. She decorated the apartment obsessively, rearranging furniture that a team of cleaners would immediately return to its original position. She exercised for 3 hours a day, her body becoming something abstract, disconnected from the person inhabiting it. She was, in every measurable way, a success. She had won the lottery of circumstance and married the winner, and yet, every morning she woke feeling like she was drowning in air. The intercom buzzed. The security guard's voice crackled through, uncertain, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Kofi, there's a man at the gate. He's wet. Says he needs help. I told him to move along, but the rain is heavy and there's a child with him. I thought I should ask you." Amara's heart did something it hadn't done in years. It moved without permission. She didn't think about consequences, about Kofi's reaction, about propriety or the neighborhood's expectations. She simply moved, drawn by something she didn't recognize in herself. "Let him in," she said. Chapter 2. The Stranger at the Gate. The man was small, diminished by the rain that still fell in sheets across the compound, water streaming down the driveway in rivers that carried leaves and garbage toward the street. His clothes clung to him like skin, and his eyes held the particular wildness of someone who had been running from something for so long they'd forgotten what it was. Behind him stood a boy, no more than 7, shaking so violently his teeth chattered audibly, his lips taking on a faint bluish tinge. The child held a piece of soggy cardboard that had once been a drawing, now reduced to pulp. The colors bleeding into one another. Amara's hand went to her mouth. "Please," the man said. His voice was hoarse, fractured, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. "I know I shouldn't be here. I know this is... I just need to use a phone or shelter just until the rain stops. The boy, he's cold. He has asthma. The wet makes it worse." Something in her chest broke open. Not the practiced sympathy of a donor to a charity gala, but something primal, something that remembered what it meant to see suffering and respond with the whole of yourself. She brought them inside without hesitation. The security guard watched with confusion as she ushered them past. She was breaking some protocol, she supposed. There would be consequences. She found she didn't care. Kofi was still in his study. She didn't inform him. She dried the boy with towels that cost more than his entire life, wrapped him in a cashmere blanket from their guest room, gave him hot chocolate that he drank with both hands, his eyes never leaving her face, as if she might vanish at any moment. The man she seated in the kitchen. She found dry clothes from Kofi's closet, expensive things that hung oddly on a body shaped by poverty. She made tea. Her hands were trembling. Finally, when the boy was drowsy and warm, she asked, "What's your name?" "Segun," he said. His voice was steadier now, but something in it still trembled. "And this is Tunde, my nephew. Where do you live?" He hesitated. His hands trembled around the cup of tea she'd given him. "In the warehouse district, there's a community there, people without homes. We were walking to find shelter when the flood came. There's a place we stay sometimes, but it flooded tonight. Everything was swept away." Amara felt something shift in her. In the warehouse district, people lived in the shadow of her husband's developments. She had driven past those areas in the car, always with the windows up, the air conditioning on, insulated from the reality. She had seen the makeshift structures from a distance, seen the children selling water bottles, the women washing clothes in contaminated streams. Kofi always looked away. "That's the price of progress," he'd said once, 6 months ago, as they passed a community being demolished. Not everyone can afford to live in the future. She had said nothing then. Now, looking at Tunde's small frame, at Segun's exhaustion, the words came back to her with new weight. "How long have you been living there?" she asked quietly. Segun's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen wall. 3 years. Before that, I worked. I was a carpenter, a good one. I built things, furniture, doors, frames. I built with my hands." He looked down at those hands now, as if they belonged to someone else. Then there was an accident on a construction site. The Okafor warehouse project in the industrial zone. A building collapsed during the night. They said it was structural failure. I know it was negligence. The inspectors were bribed, the materials were substandard, the load calculations were falsified. He paused. The silence was heavy. 30 people died, he continued. 30. I was there when it happened, working the night shift. I heard the sound, like the world breaking. I dug through the rubble with my hands until they bled. 30 people, and I couldn't save any of them. Amara's blood went cold. "My brother was one of them," Segun said. "Tunde's father. He was only 42 years old." She didn't ask the company's name. She already knew. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Deception. That night, Amara didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness of her bedroom while Kofi snored beside her. His face peaceful in a way she'd never seen it in daylight. His breathing was deep and regular, the respiration of a man with a clear conscience, or perhaps a man with no conscience at all. She had never been sure which was worse. She thought about the warehouse district, about Tunde's eyes when he held the cup of hot chocolate. Wonder mixed with something like shame, as if he wasn't accustomed to kindness and didn't trust it. About the way his small fingers had trembled, holding the cup, the way he had asked permission before taking each sip. About Segun's hands, calloused, competent, now worthless in a city that had decided he was disposable. 30 people. She rose quietly at 3 a.m., moving through the apartment like a thief in her own home. The penthouse was different at night. Less impressive, more exposed. The expensive furniture looked like artifacts in a museum. The abstract art on the walls was just violence in neutral colors. She went to Kofi's study. The room smelled like leather and whiskey. His desk was vast, minimalist, with a single computer and 3 phones. She knew his passwords. He was arrogant enough to think she didn't care. He had even written one down in a drawer, beneath some business cards. Kofi King 2015. His birth year, his self-coronation, visible for anyone to find. The files were there. Contracts, permits, inspection reports stamped approved by officials whose names appeared in multiple columns of payment. A network of corruption rendered visible in spreadsheets, and there at the center, a memo from 8 years ago about the warehouse renovation project. She read it slowly, each word landing like a stone. Structural concerns flagged. Corrective action recommended. Project timeline cannot be adjusted. Below it, Kofi's handwritten note in blue ink. Proceed. Budget adjustments cannot be made. Proceed with existing specifications. Below that, a signature from the project manager. Approved, Okafor Development Corp. 30 people. She printed the documents with trembling hands. She printed everything, every file, every email, every memo. The printer hummed softly in the darkness, a mechanical whisper that sounded like betrayal. Her heart pounded as if she were committing a crime, though the only crime in the room was already committed. She didn't know what she would do with the documents. She only knew that this knowledge, could not be unknown now. It sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and real. In the morning, she made breakfast for Segun and Tunde. Kofi came down to the kitchen, stopping short when he saw them. His face shifted through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, recognition, calculation, fear. "Amara," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "What is this?" "Guests," she said simply. "They needed shelter. The boy is asleep. He has asthma." Kofi's eyes fixed on Segun. A moment passed between them, something that Amara couldn't quite read. Then Kofi looked away. "They should leave," he said. "It's not appropriate." But he didn't ask them to leave himself. He left for the office an hour later, moving quickly, his jaw tight. Amara watched him go, then turned back to Segun. "I need to show you something," she said. Chapter 4. The weight of knowing Segun read the documents in silence while Tunde slept in the next room. His hands shook. At one point, he stopped and pressed his palms against his eyes. She had never seen a man try so hard not to cry. "This is him," Segun said finally. "This is Kofi Okafor. This is the man who killed my brother." "Yes," Amara said. "And you're married to him?" "Yes." Segun looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because," she said, and she was surprised to find herself crying, "I can't keep living on graves." That afternoon, Amara called her lawyer, a woman named Aid, who had become her friend, one of the few people in her life who seemed real. They met in a cafe in a neighborhood Kofi had never taken her to. "I want to report him," Amara said. She placed the documents on the table. "I want the authorities to know what happened at the warehouse. I want it investigated properly." Aid read through the papers carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to anger. "These are direct evidence of negligence, of criminal negligence. I know. Amara, this will destroy your marriage. It will destroy your life as you know it." "My life as I know it is a lie," Amara said, "and I'm tired of living it." Chapter 5. The Geometry of Choice. The decision crystallized over 3 days. Segun told her more about the families, about the paperwork that was lost, about the corruption so thick it was like fog, about how he'd tried to fight it, how he'd gone to journalists who suddenly weren't interested, to lawyers who quoted fees he couldn't imagine, how eventually fighting had become just surviving. He told her about the funerals. He told her about Tunde asking why his father wasn't coming home. He told her about living under bridges and in abandoned buildings. He told her about watching his nephew's childhood disappear into survival. Amara moved through her marriage like someone walking through a museum of her own life. She watched Kofi shave, watched him kiss her goodbye at the door, watched him drive away in his imported car with its seats made from animal leather, and she didn't recognize him anymore. Or perhaps she recognized him for the first time, saw beneath the tailoring and the cologne to the man who had chosen the profit margin over 30 lives, who had decided that budget corrections were more important than structure, than safety, than the fact that his decision meant small children would grow up orphaned. She sat at dinner with him and watched his hands cut meat. Hands that had written the memo, hands that had signed the documents. She realized she had never truly looked at him before. She had only looked at the version of him she had imagined. She met with Adi again. They gathered every document, organized it chronologically, created a narrative that was impossible to deny. Aid knew a journalist, a real one, not the kind Kofi had in his pocket. Together they prepared the story. Amara connected Segun with a legal aid organization. She sat with him in a small office where a lawyer named Bami reviewed the case, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is solid," Bami said. "It will be years, but this is solid. We can win this." "And my brother?" Segun asked quietly. "Your brother's death will have meant something," Bami said. "It will have consequences. That's not justice, not really, but it's something." On the 4th day, Kofi came home early. His face was dark, shuttered. She was sitting in the living room with Segun and Tunde, the boy reading a book she'd brought from her childhood, illustrations of animals in a savannah he'd never seen. "What is this?" Kofi's voice was quiet. "Dangerous. She had never heard him sound afraid before. "The documents have been sent to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission," Amara said. Her voice was steady. This surprised her. "And to 3 independent journalists. I've also connected Segun with Bami's legal team. They're reviewing the case." The silence that followed was the size of the ocean. Kofi's face went through several colors: red, white, grayish. He looked at Segun, at Tunde, at the stack of papers on the coffee table, at Amara's face. She watched him calculate the cost of confession versus denial, the probability of escape versus consequences. "You've destroyed us," he said finally, not angry, almost wondering. "Our life, my business, everything." "No," Amara said, and she was surprised to find she was crying, not from sadness, but from relief. "I've ended a lie. Everything we had was built on graves, Kofi. I just couldn't live on a grave anymore." He left that night. "Comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories of hope and redemption can travel." Chapter 6. The Unraveling. The next morning, Kofi's lawyers contacted her. They came to the apartment with the efficiency of men accustomed to managing crises. They wore expensive suits and carried briefcases that looked like weapons. They offered her money to recant her statement, to disappear, to pretend the documents had been a mistake. "Your husband is willing to be generous," one of them said. "His name was Adeyemi, and he had the kind of confidence that only comes from never being told no. A settlement, enough to live very comfortably. Internationally, if you prefer." "No," Amara said. "You're certain?" Adeyemi looked almost confused, as if refusal wasn't a genuine option. "You're going to testify against him? Destroy your marriage, your reputation, your life?" "It's already destroyed," Amara said. "I'm just cleaning up the rubble." They left. Within hours, the narrative shifted. The first news story broke, not the story Aid had prepared with the journalist, but another story. Amara, it appeared, was having an affair with Segun. She had stolen documents from her husband's office. She was mentally unstable, possibly having a breakdown. She had been hospitalized 6 years ago for depression, a detail Amara had forgotten she'd ever mentioned to anyone. Her phone began to ring. Her mother called, her voice shaking. "What have you done? What have you done to our family's reputation?" Friends from the galas began messaging, their tone shifting from concern to distance to something like contempt. One message came from a woman she'd known for 10 years. "I can't believe you would do this to him. He gave you everything." But Bami's office was preparing their own story. They had the documents, they had Segun's testimony, they had the families, the 30 families that nobody had listened to before. And they had Amara's honesty, raw and uncomplicating. The journalist Aid they knew, a woman named Zainab, published the first real story on a Sunday morning. Construction executive faces criminal charges. Leaked documents reveal negligence in warehouse collapse that killed 30. The piece was comprehensive. It laid out the timeline, the corruption, the falsified documents, the deliberate ignorance. It quoted Segun. It quoted Bami. It printed Kofi's memo, word for word. Budget adjustments cannot be made. Proceed with existing specifications. The response was immediate. The stock market shifted. Kofi's business partners began distancing themselves. Journalists who had previously ignored the warehouse story suddenly became interested. Within 3 days, the police knocked on the apartment door. Chapter 7. The Price of Principle. The legal process was long and brutal. Kofi's lawyers fought with the weapons that money buys: delays, technicalities, character assassinations. They painted Amara as an ungrateful wife, a thief of corporate secrets, mentally unstable. They suggested she'd been seduced by Segun, that this was passion masquerading as principle. They filed motions claiming the documents had been obtained illegally, that Amara had violated marital privacy, that her testimony was inadmissible. She lost the apartment. Kofi's lawyers moved swiftly, claiming it was marital property, freezing the accounts, tying everything in litigation. The bank accounts were frozen, all of them. She had perhaps 50 Zuzera naira in physical cash, which she kept in a box under her bed. Friends who had kissed her at galas suddenly couldn't remember her name. Women she'd known for years crossed the street to avoid her. Kofi's colleagues made sure her name was whispered in certain circles with a particular kind of contempt reserved for women who break the rules of the game. But slowly, impossibly, the case moved forward. The EFCC opened an investigation. Zainab's story triggered something. Other journalists began pursuing their own angles, finding their own sources. A second construction company came forward, admitting to similar practices under Kofi's supervision. A whistleblower from the inspection office came forward, revealing the bribery network. Bami moved faster than anyone expected. The first court appearance happened on a Tuesday morning. Amara sat in the gallery, her heart pounding. She wore a simple dress, nothing expensive. Segun sat beside her. Tunde was in school. They'd agreed that the boy didn't need to be here. Kofi's lawyer argued the documents were fraudulent. Bami produced the chain of custody. She produced the original files from Kofi's computer, accessed through a warrant. She produced testimony from the IT specialist who verified the documents' authenticity. The judge, an elderly woman named Justice Okoro, read everything carefully. She looked at Kofi, then at Segun, then at Amara. "This court will open a full investigation," she said. "In the meantime, pending charges are being filed. Negligence resulting in death, conspiracy to defraud, bribery of public officials, and filing false safety documents." Kofi's passport was revoked that afternoon. Chapter 8. The Smaller Life. Amara moved into a small apartment in the Yaba district with Segun and Tunde. It was the first time she'd lived without hired help. It was 3 rooms, on the 5th floor of a building that was perpetually being renovated, with windows that overlooked a street market. The walls were thin. She could hear neighbors' arguments, children crying, the Quran being recited at 5 a.m., the smell of cooking from 6 different homes. It was real. She learned to cook, not the way she'd been taught in expensive classes, how to plate food like art, how to create meals that looked like architecture, but real cooking. What could she buy at market with what money remained? How long could she make it last? How could she feed 3 people on almost nothing? Segun went to every market with her, helping carry things, teaching her which sellers were honest, which were overcharging. They became friendly with vendors. They became part of a community instead of above it. Tunde started school at the local government primary school. The first day, Amara walked him there, nervous. The school was crowded, loud, full of children who would never step foot in a penthouse. Tunde looked terrified. By the end of the week, he had friends. By the end of the month, he was happy in a way Amara had never seen. Segun found work again, not immediately, but gradually. A builder recognized his reputation. Small jobs first, then larger ones. His hands remembered their purpose. She would watch him work. Watch the way his body moved, with intention and skill. And she realized she had married Kofi without ever knowing a man who could actually make something. She volunteered at a legal clinic in a building that had once been a government office. The work was hard but necessary. Poor people trying to navigate a legal system designed to exclude them. Landlords, employers, police, all of it structured to ensure that the powerless remained powerless. She used her knowledge of the system, knowledge gained from the other side, to help people fight it. It was small work, but it was real. Segun tried to apologize for the burden of his presence. "I've ruined you," he said one evening. He, watching her wash dishes by hand in a tiny sink with water that came in only when the city decided to release it. "No," she said. Her hands were in warm, soapy water. Her fingernails were broken. She was happier than she'd ever been. He ruined both of us. I'm just choosing not to live with that ruin anymore. They weren't lovers. Though the lawyers and the journalists and the neighbors assumed they were something stranger and more necessary. Two people who had been broken and were learning how to build something from the pieces. There was affection between them, yes, and gratitude, but also space, understanding, the knowledge that healing sometimes requires solitude even when you're sharing a life. Chapter 9. The investigation deepens. 18 months into the legal process, it became clear that Kofi's corruption was only the surface. The EFCC began investigating his suppliers, his contractors, the officials who had approved his projects. A network emerged, complex and systemic. Kofi had been part of something larger than himself, though that didn't diminish his responsibility. Bemi began calling Amara with updates. Each one was darker than the last. "There's another building," Bami said one evening. "Completed 3 years ago. Structural reports indicate it's unsound. If something happens, evacuate it," Amara said. "We don't have the authority, but we're filing a petition." "Then file it," Bami also called with another piece of information. "We found records of Kofi's personal involvement in the inspector bribery. Documentation, conversations, it's very clear." Amara felt nothing. She had accepted the truth about her husband months ago. What she felt now was only the weight of knowing that the system that had protected him was larger than she'd imagined. Sagan became an important part of the legal case. They needed expert testimony about construction standards, about what he'd seen in the building before it collapsed, about the irregularities in the materials. He gave testimony that was technical but also personal. He spoke about his brother, about Tunde, about the cost of negligence measured not in money but in lives. The journalists came to their apartment to interview him. Zainab brought others with her. They wanted the story of the stranger who had entered a rich woman's home and changed everything. Amara refused to be interviewed. She said only, "My husband built on top of graves. I chose to stop living on them." That line was quoted everywhere. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. 2 years after the warehouse collapse had first made the news, 8 years after it had actually happened, the court ruled. Kofi Okafor found guilty on multiple counts: negligence resulting in death, conspiracy to defraud, bribery, falsification of documents, sentencing 12 years imprisonment with hard labor. The settlement to the families of the 30 victims was substantial, not enough to bring anyone back, but enough to change lives. 30 families suddenly had resources to survive, to rebuild, to dream. Amara attended the verdict with Segun and Tunde, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judgment was read, she watched Kofi's face collapse. Not with remorse, but with the shock of a man discovering that consequences actually existed. There was no victory in it. The dead remained dead. But there was something like balance, a reckoning that acknowledged what had been taken. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They wanted statements, reactions, the story of the woman who had brought down the millionaire. But Amara didn't give interviews. She held Tunde's hand and walked past them all. Segun walked beside her, his expression neutral, his mind somewhere else. That evening, an envelope arrived at their apartment. It was from Kofi's lawyer, divorce papers, signed. A final check for her portion of assets before the remaining were distributed to the settlement fund. The check was substantial, enough to change their lives again. She stared at it for hours while Segun slept and Tunde did his homework. "Take it," Segun said, though she hadn't asked. He'd been awake, watching her. "You've earned it." "It's blood money," she said. "No," he replied. "It's payment for what was stolen, for justice, for the courage to choose this over that." He gestured around their small, honest apartment. She thought of Tunde's father. crushed beneath negligently constructed walls. She thought of 29 other people, families destroyed, lives unmade. She thought of Tunde, alive in school, safe, because one woman had finally looked at the comfort she was drowning in and chosen to stop drowning. She endorsed the check. If this story already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps Amara's message reach more people who still believe in kindness. Chapter 11. The Revelation. 3 years after the verdict, Amara received a letter. The handwriting was uncertain, almost childlike, the letters uneven and pressed hard into the paper, as if the writer was concentrating intensely on each word. It was from Kofi. He was in a minimum security facility, allowed to work in the prison's carpentry shop. The letter was brief, halting, the words of a man learning language for the first time or relearning it after a lifetime of lies. He wrote about the other inmates, men who had also built on the backs of the powerless, men from the construction industry, the inspection offices, the government. He wrote about a particular young man who had lost his father in the warehouse collapse, who worked in the shop and had recognized Kofi on his first day. He wrote about that young man staring at him silently for an entire day. He wrote, "That young man has not spoken to me since, but I see his face. I see all of their faces. The men I worked with, the families of the people who died. You were right. I built on graves. I stood on the bodies of people I never saw. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am only saying that I understand now what you understood then. That some choices close doors, but the right doors. That some prices are worth paying. That you were never drowning in air. You were the only one breathing." Amara read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Segun. "He's learning," Segun said simply. "Can people change?" she asked. "People are always changing," he replied. "The question is whether they change toward cruelty or compassion. Kofi had to lose everything to choose the latter. That's a terrible education, but it's still education." Amara didn't write back, but she didn't destroy the letter either. She kept it as evidence of something she'd begun to believe, that redemption isn't about returning to innocence. It's about finally seeing clearly and then choosing to act on what you see. Chapter 12. The Fullness of Simple Things. 5 years after Segun appeared at the gate, Amara stood in a different kind of office, not a corporate tower, but a small storefront in the warehouse district where it all had begun. The space had been empty, abandoned. Segun had rebuilt it with his own hands. It was a carpentry workshop, and also something like a school. Young men from the community came here to learn, to gain skill, to be given something the city had taken away, dignity through craft and mastery. The walls were lined with beautiful things, cabinets, doors, frames, furniture, each one marked with the maker's initials. A wooden plaque near the entrance read, "Built with purpose, built to last." Tunde was 12 now, almost 13. He worked with his uncle some afternoons after school, learning, his small hands becoming skilled and strong. He wanted to be an architect, he told Amara with certainty. He wanted to design buildings that were safe, that were built to last, that didn't kill people. He wanted to ensure that no one else's child would lose a parent to negligence. Amara had found her own work. She now directed a non-profit focused on labor rights and construction site safety. The organization had grown faster than she'd anticipated. They had offices in 3 states. They trained inspectors. They advocated for policy change. They represented workers in disputes. She testified in cases. She trained others to testify. She wrote reports that were read and sometimes, against all odds, acted upon. One afternoon, a young journalist named Chisholm came to the workshop to interview her about the original case. This journalist was thorough, intelligent, clearly inspired by Zainab's work. They sat in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood and the sound of hammering. Do you regret it? Chisholm asked. Everything you lost? Amara looked around the small space. At the calendar on the wall, drawn by Tunde, at the photographs of families, workers, safe buildings, at her hands, no longer manicured, stronger from living, at Segun across the room, teaching a young man how to join wood properly, at the wood shavings on the floor, the honest materials, the honest work. I regret that it was necessary, she said. I regret that I lived for so long not knowing what my comfort was built on. I regret that 30 people had to die before anyone listened. But the choice itself? No. Choosing Segun wasn't about choosing a poor man over a rich one. It was about choosing reality over illusion, choosing to be awake. Would you do it again? Chisholm pressed. I have to do it again, Amara said. Every day. That's the real work, not the single act of defiance, the daily work of staying awake, of building something real, of remembering whose graves the old foundation was made from. Chapter 13. The Architect of Tomorrow. Tunde's university entrance exams came when he was 17. He scored in the top percentile of the entire state. His essay for the architecture program was about his father, about the warehouse, about the kind of buildings he wanted to create. Buildings are not just structures, he wrote. They are promises. They are statements about who matters and whose lives the builder considers valuable enough to protect. My father died in a building that was a lie, a building that promised safety and delivered death. I want to build buildings that keep their promises. I want to design structures that treat human life as sacred and non-negotiable. He was accepted to 3 universities. He chose the one with the strongest engineering program. Amara took him to the campus on his first day, her heart swollen with something she didn't have words for. He was nervous, excited, ready. As they carried his things into the dormitory, she thought about Segun's brother, about how this moment would never have existed if not for the choice she'd made. Thank you, Tunde said suddenly, as if reading her mind. For what? Amara asked. For not letting it end there, he said, for making sure it meant something. Chapter 14. The quiet continuation. Years later, Amara would sit with Tunde, now a university student studying structural engineering, and he would ask her about that night when she brought him inside from the rain. How did you know? He would ask. How did you know what it would mean? She would think about this carefully. She would think about the woman she had been in that penthouse, slowly drowning in luxury, and the woman she became the moment she chose differently. She would think about the space between those two selves, how small it was and how vast. I didn't know, she would say finally. I only knew that I couldn't pretend anymore, that pretending had become a kind of death, and that when death is what you choose over truth, the only redemption is to choose the opposite, to choose the stranger, the risk, the uncertain path that leads toward something real. Tunde would nod, understanding something deeper than her words. Segun would bring tea. He had aged gracefully, his hair becoming silver, his hands still strong. His carpentry business had expanded. Now there were 3 workshops, training dozens of young men. He had become something like a father to many of them. They would sit together in a room built with honest hands, a room Segun had constructed himself, each joint perfect, each detail considered. The furniture was beautiful and functional. The light came through windows that framed the neighborhood, the community, the world as it actually was. And Amara, once a woman suspended in glass above the city, would sit with her people, the people she had chosen, breathing the sweet, ordinary air of a life finally lived. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Conscience. 10 years after the verdict, a building in Lagos collapsed. It was not one of Kofi's buildings, but it was built according to similar standards, negligent, corrupt, constructed with bribery and falsified documents. 32 people died. This time, the response was different. Within hours, journalists invoked Kofi's case. Within days, the investigation was thorough and swift. Within months, charges were filed. The system, once so resistant, had been changed by one woman's choice to stop living on graves. Amara was invited to speak at a safety conference. She stood before a room of builders, engineers, inspectors, and government officials. Many of them didn't want to hear what she had to say, but they listened anyway. "Every building is a moral statement," she told them. "It says who you think deserves to survive and who you think can be sacrificed. It says whether you believe human life is sacred or negotiable. It says whether you're building for people or for profit. The buildings in this city are covered with the blood of people who were decided, unilaterally and quietly, to be expendable." She paused, letting that land. "I was married to a man who made that decision. I lived in a building that was his moral statement, and I lived in denial about what that statement meant. It took a stranger appearing at my gate to wake me up. It took a poor man and a child to remind me what I was built on. I don't wish that for anyone, but if you're sleeping, if you're pretending, if you're building on graves, I hope you wake up too." The room was silent for a long time. Epilogue. The sound of water. Years continue. Tunde graduates and becomes an engineer who specializes in sustainable, ethical construction. He works with communities on reconstruction projects, ensuring that their voices are part of the design process. Zagun's workshops expand into a full school for construction trades. Amara's non-profit becomes a model for other countries. Kofi is released after serving his sentence. He doesn't contact Amara, but he does reach out to families who lost people in the warehouse collapse, asking if there are ways he can use the rest of his life to repair what he destroyed. Most don't want his involvement. Some do. He works quietly, without fanfare, building small things with his hands in the workshop, no longer the man who commanded corporations. One evening, Amara stands at a new construction site with Tunde. The building going up here will house workers and their families. It's designed with safety as the primary principle, not as an afterthought. Every material is inspected, every decision is documented, every worker is treated as someone whose life matters. "This is what it should have been from the beginning," Tunde says, his hand on the structure. "Yes," Amara agrees. She thinks about the moment a stranger appeared at her gate. She thinks about how that single moment of compassion, of refusing to look away, set off a chain of events that changed a city. She thinks about how one act of conscience can echo across decades, remaking the world, one building, one decision, one life at a time. The sun sets over Lagos, indifferent to the reckoning and the redemption happening below. But Amara sees it differently now. She sees the city as a text, written in buildings and choices, every structure a testament to someone's moral decision. And she knows that the story of conscience is never finished. It's a sound that continues to ripple outward, waking people who are sleeping on graves. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, courage, and second chances. Thank you for watching. African woman rejected her rich husband for a poor stranger. The reason left everyone wow. And remember, one act of kindness can rewrite a destiny.